Alright, this is the review for the Africa test, Unit 6, coming to you from my, or at least my wife's classroom. You can kind of see some of it, also known as the garage. It's 9 o'clock at night again, but hopefully I'll be a little bit more exciting than the last video. Alright, so looking at the test, there's a lot of maps and charts in this one as well, obviously interpreting graphs, things like that. So starting out, first thing, need to remember what desertification is. We talked about that extensively, and there's about 2 or 3 slides where it really goes in detail about what causes desertification. So cattle's overgrazing on land, and also their hooves just beating down on the ground and compacting the ground, not allowing anything to grow, and of course the desert spreading. The other thing is people farming too much on the same soil, and they don't let it replenish the nutrients in that soil, and so it never really returns back to what it was able to do and what it was able to produce at one point. And so eventually it just basically turns into desert. So desertification is the spreading of the desert. You see that occurring mainly in the Sahel, which is the region on the southern part of the Sahara Desert where it is spreading the most. And with AIDS, there's going to be a few questions about AIDS. Of course, remember, obviously, Africa is the continent that is affected the most by HIV/AIDS out of any other continent on Earth. Chart on HDI, Human Development Index. Again, remember what that means. So basically, the country that has the highest GDP, has the highest literacy rates, things like that, will be the best country. The richest country. Alright, then Africa, I mentioned how Africa is mainly a large plateau and also has a lot of basins. And because of that, the rivers that flow through there are going to have a lot of waterfalls, rapids, and things of that sort. So most of the rivers that are in Africa aren't navigable, or at least they're limited in their ability to be able to be used for trade and things of that sort, like the Nile, for example. People can use the Nile down to a certain point, but then there's a series of cataracts, basically small waterfalls, rapids, where you can't do anything. So everyone settled north of that area and just used the part of the Nile they could. So because of the plateaus and the basins, there's a lot of different cataracts or breaks in the river to where you can't really use it for trade. And then overall, Africa's climate, what it's like overall. So mainly deserts. We got some warm tropics, and of course some snow-capped mountains like Kilimanjaro. And then subsistence agriculture. Of course, remember that most Africans are engaged in subsistence agriculture, which is at the primary level of economic activity. So again, remember primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. Pretty sure it's been on every test. And then we talked about the Osman High Dam along the Nile River and some pros and cons about that. So again, go back over that list, make sure you know the positives and negatives. And some of the positives were things like regulating the flow of water, so it doesn't flood really that much, decreases drought, but also there's no silt left behind to help with farming, so that's taken out, so that's a negative. Also, there's more mosquitoes. It's kind of a breeding ground for mosquitoes, and so you're going to see a lot more malaria. The Berlin Conference, we talked about this extensively as well. Remember the purpose of the Berlin Conference, and that was to divide Africa up among European powers. So European nations are dividing Africa, so European nations would not go to war against each other over that competition. And you know why there's so many diseases in Africa. We talked about those today, such as malaria, TB, cholera, things of that sort. So obviously, it's several things really. You got a lack of education, which allows some things to spread, like AIDS. A lack of education when it comes to sex ed. Widespread poverty. Again, because of that, you're not going to have access to healthcare and things of that sort. Things are going to be dirtier, allowing more parasites and things like that to thrive among human populations. And of course, the unstable governments. That in turn, you're going to have bad economies, bad healthcare systems, lack of infrastructure to take care of people or limit these diseases, get medicine and help to these people, and so the diseases spread more so. And then you know why malaria is so prevalent in Africa, and really that has to do with their climate for the most part, and vegetation. Really just, it's a great breeding ground for malaria because you don't have winter, you don't have things like that to help limit the mosquito population. And then you need to know the link between colonialization, like Europeans coming in and colonizing Africa, and the ethnic tensions that are there in Africa. So basically, like the Berlin Conference, they put ethnic groups together that for a long time throughout history have not gotten along with each other. And then they would put local people in power and give them power over the people and ruling them harshly. All right, and then you also need to know, like looking at the physical geography of Africa, how that affects trade within Africa. And we also talked about that in that article that you did with those questions you answered. So a lot of Africa really has harsh climates. You got the Sahara Desert, you got the rainforest, things of that sort, which makes it really hard to build any kind of infrastructure to connect all of Africa together. So trade is very difficult, especially in your landlocked countries in Central Africa. And so trade is not easy whatsoever unless you're lucky enough to be along the Mediterranean or the Atlantic or Indian Oceans. All right, in Africa we've seen an increase in commercial farming, meaning basically you can say like companies really coming in and buying up land and then farming, and that's causing the small, just family farmer basically to run out of business. He can't compete against the commercial farmer. So you need to know what this leads to. And the obvious answer is that this is going to lead to urbanization. People are going to move to cities to look for other opportunities. If you can't compete against the big guy in farming, then you're going to go and do something else. So you're seeing this movement to the cities within Africa because of that. All right, then apartheid in South Africa. We talked about it. We didn't go in tons of detail. We didn't have a lot of time. But apartheid, remember, is the separation or segregation of the races in South Africa between the blacks and the whites. So Africans, your native Africans, were not allowed to have the same kind of jobs white people did. Were not educated at the same level white people were. So a lot of racist laws and things like that were adopted at the time to fight against the Africans and really keep them down and oppressed during that time period. Also remember that ended in 1994 with the election of Nelson Mandela as president. And then the difference in culture between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, and you know why that's different. Obviously it's the Sahara Desert that separates them. So Northern Africa is mainly Muslim, speak Arabic, really connected to the Middle East. Whereas in Sub-Saharan Africa is animistic or Christian for the most part, and the cultures are vastly different. They didn't have much connection to each other whatsoever. So just remember the Sahara Desert is the physical reason why there's that separation. All right, then you see human rights violations in many countries in Africa, and that's because the leaders in those countries have absolute power and they can do what they want. So you see a lot of dictatorships which treat people horribly throughout Africa. And then I also mentioned when the Europeans colonized Africa that they only invested in infrastructure that helped reach the natural resources they were trying to extract from Africa. So they didn't build hospitals and airports and things of that sort that may help out Africa. They only built things that helped the Europeans out to reach those natural resources they needed. So they really didn't invest back into those countries. All right, and then whenever the Europeans gave African countries independence, really starting in the 1960s, there are several things that went wrong with that, mainly because Europe, like I said, did not invest into the infrastructure of that country, therefore not really preparing it for any kind of success in the future. They did not train them on how to be an independent country and start prepping them for that transition. They just kind of left them high and dry. And then, of course, they made up these boundaries for the countries that didn't make any sense when you look at the ethnic differences and the tribes that they put together. And so because of that, once they left, you, of course, see economic disaster. You see tyrannical governments take over, mainly warlords, because remember, the Europeans gave guns and things like that to the leaders that were helping them. And so those people use those guns then to take over, take control, and set up these tyrannical governments that don't help at all bring about peace or freedom for anybody. All right, and then the end of apartheid, along with that, you also need to know the economic impact on South Africa. Before apartheid ended, back in the 1980s, different American companies and also some other European companies stopped doing trade with South Africa. And there was also several companies that literally pulled their business out of South Africa completely. So once apartheid ended, those companies came back, started doing business again with South Africa, rejuvenating the economy of South Africa quite a bit. So once apartheid ended, you see a lot more business return to that country because they took it away as a form of punishment, try to put pressure on them to change their ways. All right, there's a lot of little vignettes, little readings, things like that. And then you need to know overall the different types of climate regions you'll find in Africa. Obviously, a big part of it is in the tropical zones between the Tropic of Cancer and Capricorn. You also have a Mediterranean climate along the northern coast of Africa, along the Mediterranean Sea. And of course, arid desert climates as well. There's nothing really in Africa that's cold. And then you also see a lot of the languages in Africa. There are several different languages in Africa. A lot of them are a mix of European languages from the European colonizers that came in, and then the local languages all throughout Africa. And so you see this, basically this diffusion, if you will, of European languages throughout Africa, and then changing those to fit the particular area. So you kind of get this weird mix, kind of like English and Spanish, and you get Spanglish that you hear in Texas, where it's not really Spanish and it's not English, it's just this new made-up version. So here, a few more charts. All right, and then looking, we talked about two genocides in Africa, the one in Darfur and then the one in Rwanda. Keep in mind with both of those wars, genocides, you have two legitimate armies fighting each other. So it's a civil war. Like in Rwanda, for example, you had the RPF, Rwandan Patriotic Front, which is the Tutsi army. They're the rebels. They're fighting the Hutu army, which was controlled by the Hutu government in power in Rwanda. Those are two legitimate militaries going to war against each other like any other war. But then you had a subgroup called the Interahamwe, which was targeting Tutsis within Rwanda and killing them, which was also supported kind of behind the back by the Hutu army. So you have two wars going on at the same time. So whenever there's a genocide, usually it's part of another war. You have the civil war going on, and then you have this kind of war in the background that's just targeting civilians, that's supported by the government, but not in a very obvious way. You saw that in Rwanda, same thing in Darfur with the Sudanese government and the Janjaweed. More maps. All right, I need to know why African leaders generally aren't replaced with free elections. And really it has to do with the fact that Africa does not have a history of democracy. And so it's easy for the leaders in those countries to manipulate the people and the system to maintain control and make sure they don't lose the power. So it's just a lack of... really just a lack of history, a lack of dealing with democracy, knowing how it works, and of course a lack of education among the people that don't know any better. The Columbian Exchange, whenever Europeans found the Americas, the Columbian Exchange started between Africa, Europe, and the Americas. The most important thing that was brought from Africa over to the Americas was, of course, slaves. So that was called the Middle Passage from Africa to the Americas. So slaves were brought across on ships for about 300 years. And again, going back to apartheid again, another question on it. Just make sure that you remember that black males were not given the same kind of jobs and stuff like that like white men were. So they weren't able to attain the same standard of living whatsoever because of that. Another question about the Oswanhide Dam again. Another map. And then going back again to the, well, first off, physical geography question. We talked about when plate boundaries, tectonic plate boundaries are pulling apart from each other, that's a divergent zone. So in East Africa, you have the Great Rift Valley where two plates are pulling apart from each other and creating several lakes in the middle like Lake Victoria. And eventually the Horn of Africa, where Somalia is, will break off from Africa someday in the future. And then going back to the governments again, another question about what type of government you see in Africa. And again, it's governments with limited citizen participation. Most of them, the citizens, are not involved very much at all. Chart. And then the Nile River, you need to know where it flows, what direction, where it goes through. So it flows north. It's one of the only rivers in the world that flows north. Through Sudan and up through Egypt, emptying into the Mediterranean Sea. Most of the people that live along the Nile are in Egypt for the most part. And then that's it. So if you have any other questions, of course, you can come into class. Test is on Friday. Your study guide and vocab will be due on Friday as well. And then after that, it will be Thanksgiving. So have a wonderful night. And I'll see y'all later.